Hello, and today we're going to be focusing on globalization and how it impacts the economy and cultural developments. So this is going to take us through Unit 9, which is all about the impact and ramification of globalization. And we're going to be looking at two topics today from the AP curriculum. So first, let's talk about economic developments. The trend after 1950, if you look at the chart that's on the right, you will see that trade goes up drastically from the after 1950. And by the way, if you see this highlighter going on, that relates to something with the PowerPoint. Just ignore it. So the idea is that we have this going up trend, drastic going up trend. And basically the idea is that more of the world is trading with one another and more goods are flowing across the globe than ever before. And after 1950, it's a drastic increase. Now, we want to connect this to the development of economic liberalization. And that's a term that you're going to want to be familiar with, you want to recognize. So economic liberalization means that the countries are going to adopt, if you will, again, ignore that highlighter. I'm sorry, I should have really figured out how to get that off. But you're going to see a push to get rid of trade barriers, to get rid of tariffs, to get things out of the way of economic development. And basically, countries are going to begin to embrace a free market system of capitalism. And President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who's the Prime Minister of Britain, so Prime Minister Thatcher and President Reagan are two big advocates for this free market approach. And in the 1980s, we really start to see it accelerate, where they're not just pushing it within their countries, but they're pushing it on a global scale for countries to embrace free trade. And that explains why that graph pops up so much. Now, we're going to see several countries transition over to free market economics. And we want to just focus on a few of them here in this discussion. So in Chile, in South America, we have this leader named Pinochet. So the basic idea in Chile is in 1971 or so, a communist is elected president by the people of Chile. And in 1973, Pinochet orchestrates a coup d'etat to overthrow this communist leader. And Pinochet is going to get support from the various business interests of Chile, but also from the United States. And what Pinochet brings in is a free market system to Chile. So he basically takes Chile away from the communist direction they were headed in, and he brings in a group of advisors, financial advisors, economic advisors, named the Chicago Boys. And the Chicago Boys are disciples of a University of Chicago professor named Thomas Friedman. And Thomas Friedman was a huge advocate of free trade, which emphasized deregulation and reduction, if not elimination, of tariffs. So the Chicago Boys are going to implement this in Chile, and there's going to be mixed results. Some groups get wealthier, but other groups complain that the economic system's not benefiting everyone. And so the way Pinochet responds to resistance is by arresting them, persecuting them, throwing them in jail, torturing them. There's a number of human rights violations that are associated with Pinochet. But you want to see that Chile does go to this free market approach to economics. And after Pinochet, the government does a much better job of striking a balance between free market economics and social programs to help people who are in poverty. In China, we have Deng Xiaoping, and he is the leader of the Communist Party after Mao Zedong. And what he implements are a series of economic reforms that starts to transform China into a market-based economy. He begins reforms where peasants are allowed to own the crops they produce and sell off surplus crops for profit. And what this leads to is a boom in agricultural production. He's going to allow for limited private industries, limited private businesses to manufacture products to serve the consumer's needs and not have to be limited by the party dictates and the party demands. Now, these economic reforms starts to transform China into a free market economy. However, when the people start to demand political rights, the Communist Party will not be one to really comply. Instead, the Communist Party will actively shut down demonstrations. They will persecute people who are speaking out against the government. And the greatest form of this kind of government crackdown is seen in Tiananmen Square. In 1989, a pro democracy movement builds and develops within Tiananmen Square, which is kind of a central location of the Chinese nation. And this Tiananmen Square protests begin to grow in numbers. And in late May into early June 5th, I believe is the exact date of 1989, the Chinese government roll in the tanks, they roll in the soldiers, and there's a bloodbath that night. And the protesters are massacred, and then the ones who escaped are subsequently hunted down, tracked down, and arrested. So the Tiananmen Square massacres is another example of kind of what we saw in Chile under Pinochet, where the government stays authoritarian, but these countries are embracing free market principles. That's starting to open them up to more global trade. And then finally, the big final one is in the Eastern Bloc nations of East Europe, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and also the former republics of the Soviet Union. Because if you remember, the Soviet Union, when it breaks up in 1991, we have a lot of individual nations that form. Three of those nations, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they used to be incorporated into the Soviet Union, but after 1992, they become independent states. Russia is also a state that emerges out of the breakup of the Soviet Union. So basically, in 1991, 1989, 1991, we have a number of former communist nations that have gotten rid of the Communist Party, and they go right to a free market economy. And that represents the impact of the downfall of communism. Once communism in the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union falls, the countries quickly shift over to an economic free market enterprise. And I mentioned in here Gorbachev and perestroika. So the idea is that when Gorbachev becomes the leader of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, he institutes a series of economic reforms called perestroika. And what he wants to do is allow for limited free market enterprise. But his reforms kind of open the floodgates of people rejecting communism. And once the Soviet Union completely disbands, the free market economy is not just a limited introduction, rather, it becomes a free for all, essentially. And then finally, the non aligned movement. So we had talked in the last unit about these non aligned countries like India and Kenya and Egypt. And these nations had practiced kind of a form of socialism, if not like borderline communism. However, in the 1980s, we start to see a shift. These countries that formerly employed socialism and communism start to transition to a free market economy. So one of the best examples I could give you of this is a much smaller scale, Vietnam. If you remember, Vietnam had become a communist state in the 1970s, and they have a communist government running the show. But by the late 1980s, early 1990s, they're transitioning to a free market economy, and they're engaging in the global trade. And yet the Vietnam country is still dominated by the Communist Party. So those are your economic developments. If we look at the next thing, and again, ignore the highlighter, the next part of the economic developments deal with the development of knowledge economies. So knowledge economies, chances are your future lies with a knowledge economy. You'll be doing jobs that involve either, I don't know how to phrase this. I know how to describe it by example. I am in the knowledge economy. So my job is to transfer knowledge to a generation. Facebook is a form of knowledge economy, is part of the knowledge economy. Social media is part of the knowledge economy. It's where you're not producing things, you're not making things with your hands or with machinery. Rather, you're creating and spreading ideas and working on and improving ideas. So knowledge economies can come in many different forms. The best examples, there's three examples I can give you. Finland. Finland, in about 1980, starts to transform their economy into a communication-based economy. They're one of the forerunners, starting in the 1990s, one of the forerunners of cellular technology. So the earliest cell phones were basically being developed in Finland. And that technology required an engineering. And that engineering is what's part of that knowledge economy. Japan goes a slightly different route. After World War II, Japan is going to implement a number of protectionist policies, placing high tariffs on imports and basically trying to make the Japanese citizenship, the Japanese population, into a manufacturing population. The idea is Japan would build up these products and then export them for sale, but then they would try and limit imports. So in that way, Japan has a certain amount of mercantilism within them. But in the 1980s, Japan starts to loosen up these restrictions and they start to get involved in more of the global trade. And a lot of the best electronics are coming out of Japan. A lot of the electronic advances are coming from Japan. And Japan is diversifying their economy and paying particular attention to the development of knowledge economies. Finally, the United States and Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is the prime example of what we might consider a knowledge economy. Think about all the innovation, particularly as it relates to computers, that have come out of Silicon Valley over the past 20, 30 years. Facebook, Google, all of those are parts of the knowledge economy. Now, while the knowledge economy may be growing in more developed nations, manufacturing jobs are starting to move from those developed nations to underdeveloped and developing nations. So what happens is the factories that we learned about in the 1900s, in the late 20th and early 21st century, we start to see those factories shut down in places like England, Germany, the United States. And we start seeing factories boom throughout Asian nations and Latin American nations. And of course, the phrase "made in China" is, synonymous with this globalization. And the other thing that these Asian and Latin American nations offer is the presence of cheap labor. So we have this idea that labor laws in these countries are much less restrictive, and therefore labor is paid at a much lower rate. So that's an incentive for companies to relocate factories to these nations in order to produce things more cheaply. Now, what does that do across the board is it makes things more affordable, but it's more affordable in the developed nations than the lesser developed and the underdeveloped nations. The next thing is the transnational free trade. So free trade is a cornerstone of this global trade growth. And the idea is that free trade means I knock down tariffs. But what happens is that we start getting nations cooperating and creating free trade zones between them. So let me put it to you another way. In Montgomery County, we have 25 high schools. Now, these 25 high schools, when it comes to sports, not all schools are equal. And let's take the sport of wrestling. And let's say in wrestling, there's one school that can field a full lineup. But there's 3 schools down county, let's say, that are very close to each other, but they can't field, no one of them can field a full lineup. So anytime those 3 schools compete against the school that can compete the lineup, they're always going to lose. So the competition favors that one school that can put together the lineup, and the 3 other schools that can't put together the lineup are just going to lose every time they wrestle or have a meet with the first school or with the school that can put on that full lineup. But what happened if the 3 schools came together and created one joint wrestling team? Now they could field a full lineup, and that makes them more competitive. So yes, 3 schools are pooling their resources, but it's only because the resources they have equals the resources one other school does. So likewise, in the international trade game, the United States has a big advantage. We are a huge economy, and we are producing goods at a very cheap rate, and we're flooding the market with American-made goods. Times shift from the 1950s on, and we start getting to the 1990s, 2000s, and China starts becoming that large manufacturer of goods. So now cheap Chinese goods flood the markets, and other smaller nations have a tough time competing. So what these nations do is they pool their resources. One example is NAFTA, North America Free Trade Association or Agreement. Mexico, Canada, and the United States pull together to drop tariffs between the three nations. And what that means is that a business, an American business, let's say, can set up a factory in Mexico, have their product produced very cheaply, and then have that product brought back into the United States. And then the US can export it at a much lower cost. Now that export becomes more competitive on the global stage. The EU, the European Union, same thing basically happens. Basically, the EU comes about in the 1990s, but the economic cooperation begins in the 1950s, and it becomes the EU. It starts with the West European nations because what they're doing is they're pulling their resources in order to create a bigger economy that they all can benefit from. Over time, as the East European countries shrug off communism, they go and they join the European Union. Now, I think it's in the 20s, the number of nations that are part of the Union. And I see that graph is already going, so I was just a little bit late. But then another group called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So if you look at that chart that I've been going kind of over with the highlighter, unintentionally, I'm not moving this at all. That green line at the top, oh, that was perfect timing, represents the productivity of those six nations together. And if you look down here at the other two, you see China and India's production. The only reason those six nations can be above China and India is because they pull their resources together. Otherwise, they can't compete. Their line would be at the bottom. So pulling the resources regionally becomes a development during this period of time. And then we have global developments like the World Trade Organization, which is meant to coordinate the global interaction of trade. So the member nations come together and they agree to rules of trade and proper behaviors of trade. And if there's violations of this, they have a way of settling it. All right, so that went ahead and flipped on myself already. The economic developments with the rise of multinational corporations. A multinational corporation is a corporation that has a presence in multiple countries. So they may have a factory in Mexico, they might have a distribution center in the United States, they might have markets or a store all throughout the United Kingdom, for example. So these MNCs go by varieties of names. Apple is one such example. Nestle, Mahindra and Mahindra. Mahindra and Mahindra is an Indian company that produces farming machinery and other, I guess, heavy industry vehicles. So they represent a combination of both the manufacturing and the knowledge industries. They bring both of them together. So for example, Apple have software engineers that are developing the next Apple phone or the next iPhone. But then Apple has factories in China where those iPhones are being physically put together. So Apple has this, they're involved in every step of the process. And then lastly, these MNCs have a huge influence on the global economy. They help to create jobs in developing and underdeveloped nations. So we in the United States would look at these jobs and say, they're getting paid next to nothing. You know, this labor is very unfair, or the labor rights of these people is very restricted. But to those people, those jobs are a step up from what they were living like economically, cash cropping for the most part. So when Nike sets up a factory in one of these nations, Nike is bringing jobs, and that's actually pulling people out of poverty. But the downside to that is that the MNCs say, hey, you want our jobs, you want our presence, you've got to give us tax benefits. And also there's some other government policies that we're interested in talking with you about. For example, child labor laws. So in the United States, we have pretty strict child labor laws. But in countries like China, you don't have those child labor law protections as stringently enforced. In other countries like Bangladesh, it's even more lax. And these MNCs, what they see is cheap labor, and they want to keep the access to the cheap labor that way. So if you look at that cartoon, that kind of sums it up, where the multinationals kind of enjoy being on top and kind of away from the actual hard labor of the taxpayers. In a sense, the taxpayers are paying for these companies to kind of set up shop all across the globe. So, of course, one of the other MNCs is Disney. Disney would be another big one. So, I'll go ahead and finish speaking of Disney with globalization and culture. So now we totally change gears. So one effect of globalization is an increased economic interaction through trade, and that has ramifications all over the place. But the second one is how it impacts culture, global culture. And the idea of global culture is that the whole world, or a lot of the world, identifies with the same cultural topics. They identify with similar products, similar characters and movies, so on and so forth. But there is this move to cooperation after World War II, and we're going to talk more about this later. So, for example, when these countries start pulling together, they realize there's an incentive to help one another. So we get new political unity entities like the United Nations, the European Union, the World Trade Organization, these large multinational, I don't want to say bodies of governing because their power is limited because nationalism is still a thing, but they represent international bodies of political organization that have a heavy influence on the globe. And also, this cooperation is impacted by new technologies in both communication and transportation. These technologies is what's going to allow global culture to spread after 1950. Now, there is this idea of social and artistic changes. So we see this push for greater human rights. Again, this pops up in another section, so I'll wait to get to it. But feminism becomes a global phenomenon. Civil rights movements, here in the United States, we have a civil rights movement, but it's not just in the US where there's an attempt to call for equal rights to groups of people who have been previously alienated. That's happening throughout the globe as well. Artistic developments. An artist named Picasso comes along and creates Cubism, which violates all the rules of art. In Harlem, we have what's called the Harlem Renaissance, where an African American community starts to create literature and poetry that represents a step away from the traditional, but also becomes an expression of the African American community. And it's also here that jazz really starts to get going. So you have this idea that there's new artistic developments that are departing from the traditional rules and limitations of the past. The global culture one, this is one you all know. So I'm going to kind of go through it quickly. Music starts to become globalized. The sound of reggae with Bob Marley is going to spread throughout the globe. So here we have a Caribbean culture combining with an African culture to produce a new form of music that would be a thing we call syncretism. But because of the radio and because of television and because of movies, Bob Marley is going to have a global phenomenon. Okay, he's going to be a global phenomenon. And he's able to travel the world much easier because of air travel to perform concerts in different parts of the world. And then recently we have K-pop, Korean pop. And you think of I'm going to screw up this name, Gangnam Style. I'm going to go with that. 2012, that song, Gangnam Style. Yes, that works. There's a dance associated with it, which becomes a global phenomenon. And that only happens with YouTube and with the internet and with social media. So we're looking at how communication impacts all of this. And now you have a song that's making number one, not just in South Korea, but in the United States, throughout Europe, even in Russia. And this song is being heard and listened to by a lot of the world community. That's what we mean by globalization. Movies such as Hollywood and Bollywood are going to attract major audiences. And what's interesting, Hollywood is the American movie industry. Bollywood is an Indian movie industry. And Bollywood has musical numbers, bright colors, is a very vivid and very vivid form of movie. And Bollywood has an audience across the globe. And then also, if you think about it, if Bollywood is reflective of Indian culture or of South Asian culture, and we know that the South Asian population had migrated to parts of South Africa, to parts of South America, to the United States, you can see where that would spread as well, because now we have satellite television, which allows for Bollywood to be sent to somebody's home. And then now with the internet and the ability to stream this global culture grows even more. And then we have this idea of an Americanization effect. So the basic idea is that since Hollywood is driving a lot of this, it's going to reflect American values and American history. So take the Marvel movies, take the Avengers. That's an American comic book, but today it has a global presence. And you have all these Hollywood movies, like Endgame was shown across the world. It was a global phenomenon, not just the United States phenomenon. Social media, of course, Facebook, Twitter, and WeChat. WeChat is going to be in China. But Facebook and Twitter and WeChat allow for it allows for cultural diffusion on the level that we've never seen before. When we talked about cultural diffusion in the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean Trade Network and the Trans-Saharan trade, that diffusion took years to happen. This stuff is taking minutes, seconds even. It's happening that fast. And then, of course, we have sports contributing to global culture as well. And we see that particularly with the Olympics and World Cup soccer. You know, these two phenomena, I'm not going to describe them, but in 2016, both of them were watched by about 3.5 billion people. 3.5 billion people, that's half the world's population, is sharing in a common experience. And that's made possible by the advances in communication, but it also speaks to this globalization that has been happening and is only accelerating. And that brings me lastly to global consumerism. The idea is that we as a world are consuming similar products. People across the globe are wearing Nike shoes. People across the globe are drinking Coca-Cola. The reason why I have a picture of Coca-Cola up there is because that is the second most recognizable word in the world. If you say Coca-Cola, almost anywhere in the world, people will know what you're talking about. And of course, Coca-Cola is an American-made product that has a global market. And Coca-Cola is an MNC now. And then lastly, the impact of websites such as Amazon and Alibaba. Both of them account for a lot of the online retail sales that go on. When people buy stuff online, most of the time they're using one of those two sites. Amazon is obviously the United States, we know it well. Alibaba is China. And that platform for buying and selling goods takes place through Alibaba. And since China is the largest country in the world in terms of population, what we're doing is we're promoting similar products through the similar way of shopping. And that's the big thing to emphasize about globalization, is that the world is getting smaller. Now, in the next lecture, we'll talk about resistance, attempts to reforms, and attempts to regulate this global interaction. So until then, as always, bring any questions to me or to Ms. Johnson through email or in class, whatever works for you. And I will see you next time. Bye.